can't respond that fast. Hey, I am Chuck the Bureaucrat, and today I'm going to give you a handy tactic for dealing with a short suspense. And for those of you who didn't see my video on funny Pentagon words, let me just quickly explain what a suspense is. See, a lot of people assume that it's a deadline because it often gets associated with formal taskers. People say things like, "I got a suspense for noon on Friday." But that doesn't exactly mean that it's a deadline. We say that there's a suspense because what's really going on is there is a suspense in the decision-making process. Basically, some executive is waiting on the necessary information in order to make a decision. And the reason we say that there's a suspense for noon on Friday is because sometime after noon on Friday, that executive is going to make the decision. And one of the things about these big military headquarters is that more often than you would think, there can be very, very little time to respond to a tasker. You are going to get a short suspense. And I'm talking about having less than an hour to respond. One time I had a coworker who had to respond to a 1-minute suspense. So, knowing how to react to these situations is key. And right off the bat, let me just tell you that complaining that you don't have enough time to form a response, well, that cuts no ice. It's not just that the higher-ups are ignorant and not following the 1/3, 2/3 rule. A lot of times, these are actual fast-moving real-world issues. But you can respond to short suspenses quickly and in a productive way. First, there's usually 3 different responses that you can provide: concur, concur with comment, and non-concur. If you concur, the action moves along briskly. If you non-concur, well, then there's a hang-up. And so, when you're dealing with a short suspense, that's your real choice. Do you want it to proceed quickly, or do you want to slow it down? Oh, and I should probably tell you that I never really use that whole concur with comment response. Some people are afraid to non-concur, and so they take a kind of a wishy-washy stance where they concur with comment. But look, in the heat of the moment, a concur with comment is not going to change anybody's behavior. At best, it's useful for a minor administrative quibble, but I've seen situations where the people pushing the tasker have misspelled the general officer's name in the signature block, and when you point it out to them, they're like, "No time, no time, no time." So when you're dealing with a short suspense, do you want to slow it down or not? And my typical response is that I want to slow it down enough that my executive has a chance to weigh in. That is, I want to give my GO the ammunition to non-concur if he wants to. You see, with a lot of these short suspenses, if the action officer or the director concur, then the executive never sees the action. But if there's a non-concur, the executive normally has to endorse it. It always kind of bugs me that when there's a hot tasker moving through the building, that a certain type of action officer will concur just to avoid involving their boss. I always feel like that's stealing the decision-making authority from the executives. Instead, what I do is I look for a reason to non-concur, I put it into the system, and then I go talk to my boss. And I know, I seem like the foot-dragonest bureaucrat you've ever heard of, but consider this. Just because some office non-concurs with an action doesn't mean that the action can't proceed. If 16 offices respond and one of those offices is raising an esoteric point, the action can still move forward. In fact, I would say that in a lot of cases, a no response gums up the works even worse than a non-concur. I mean, at least with a non-concur, there's a clear reason for some kind of concern, but with a no response, I mean, does that mean that we have a really, really big problem, or somebody's just not paying attention? Second, there is a specific type of non-concur that I look for. I'm looking for some kind of violation of U.S. code, because if I'm going to put a stopper in the system, I want my argument to be that this action violates law. Anything weaker is just quibbling, and there's no real point quibbling over a short suspense. But here is the most important reason that I typically respond to a short tasker with a non-concur. My boss can withdraw it. As an action officer, I create a justification for why there should be a non-concur. And then, if my boss wants to trigger a delay, he already has that justification. And if he doesn't want to cause a delay, he just scoffs at my chicken little reasoning and concurs with the action. Now, in most cases, your boss will understand what you're doing, that you're trying to create and preserve decision space for them to maneuver in. But if you have a new general, particularly one who's in their first assignment as a general officer in the Pentagon, and especially one who wants to maintain good relationships with more senior general officers, you might want to broach this topic with them before a crisis emerges. In fact, you might want to include this as part of that discussion where you ask your senior rater those two questions that I think everybody should be asking their senior rater.